Good morning. I'm George Gabel. I'm a lawyer with Holland and Knight. I'm a maritime lawyer, and that's the framework and background from which I speak to you today. About Jacksonville, I think most of you are in school here or have some connection with Jacksonville, so I'm going to be talking about Jacksonville and what makes Jacksonville a unique place to be a transportation and logistics center. The first factor is our location. And I'm showing you a map now that shows you that Jacksonville, I think if I move it, you may not realize this, but Jacksonville is due south of Cleveland, Ohio. We're the westernmost port on the east coast of the United States. For some of you, I think, who are here from Orlando, we're even west of Orlando. So our location puts us within an 8-hour drive of 45 million people. If you take a standard truck driver's day, which is 11 hours, we're within 11 hours of 60 million people, including all of Florida and the circle that takes you up into the southeast. So location is one of our most important factors. I was in China some years ago talking with folks from China Ocean Shipping to try to persuade them to start trading with Jacksonville. They have 1.3 billion people, and it just seemed like a good idea. And so I was telling them about Jacksonville and the natural attributes that we have, the infrastructure we have, the location. And I said, I know that some of the Far Eastern countries in Asia, for us, now sometimes are bringing their ships through the Suez Canal. He said, oh, we started doing that. And I said, well, when your ship passes the Rock of Gibraltar, if you look straight ahead, that's Jacksonville. So that's our location. We also have infrastructure that's amazing, really. As you can see from the map, we're served by 3 interstate highways. Interstate 95 connects us with the Northeast, Interstate 75 with the Midwest, and we're at the end of the shortest transcontinental route in the United States, Interstate 10. Our city is served by 3 major railroads. We have more movements in and out of Jacksonville than any other port on the East Coast. So, as we point out, we're at the center of the Western Hemisphere. As far as our recognition as a port, the Florida Department of Transportation has designated Jacksonville as a national port. That's what the N means. A national port is one where the freight and cargo is coming into the city and going somewhere else largely, either from overseas to Jacksonville and then throughout the United States, or from the United States through these interstate highways and railroads out overseas. Tampa, on the other hand, as you can see, has an F, which means it's more of a regional port. That is, it's a large port, but that means that what comes into Tampa basically is consumed in the Tampa area, and what leaves from Tampa is basically produced in Tampa. Miami and Port Everglades are sort of a combination. They're obviously a national port as far as dealing with Central America, Central and South America. But they have such a large population. They also consume most of what comes in, and most of what goes out comes from Miami. We had a study done. The Logistics Advisory Group is the one of which I'm the chair. It's made up of businesses and government people from all over the city that work together. We had a study done, and the word that kept coming up most was the word gateway. And that's where Jacksonville has an advantage and is a significant attribute for our city, that we're a gateway not only for Florida, but for at least the southeastern United States and perhaps the whole United States. You can see that in North Florida, the trade and statistics share of the jobs is above the average in the rest of the state. In fact, it says that the freight-intensive industries, the region's jobs that are freight-related, accounted for almost 46% of the total jobs in North Florida. So transportation and logistics is extremely important. We had a study done to develop an international business plan, and one of the super sectors in our economy is transportation and logistics. And when students ask me about jobs in other places, I say you need to stay in Jacksonville because we are really growing as a center for transportation and logistics. I was at a conference at the University of North Florida about 5 or 6 years ago on transportation and logistics, and the panel was trying to convince the audience that we ought to focus on logistics in Jacksonville. And so during the question and answer period, I raised my hand and I said, I told him about the first two factors I've already mentioned to you, about location and infrastructure that exists. And I also said that we have the headquarters for some of the largest logistics companies in the country. CSX is a logistics company. For a long time they didn't consider themselves that. The railroads ran this country the latter half of the 19th century. I think most of the justices on the Supreme Court were railroad lawyers, but they made a big mistake. They thought they were in the railroad business. But they could have owned the barge lines, the airlines, and everything else, but what they really were in was the logistics business, and they now recognize that. We have CSX, Landstar is headquartered here, SEVA Logistics, C-Star Lines, Crowley Lines, Horizon Lines, and so Jacksonville, as I told this group, has these headquarters for logistics companies. The University of North Florida also has as one of its flagship programs to be logistics. If it had been a few years later, I could have told them about Rod Sullivan's LLM program for transportation and logistics. But anyway, after I got through telling about Jacksonville, one of the panelists who was the president of Enterprise Florida, which is the public-private partnership for economic development in Florida, said, well, you ought to just call yourselves America's Logistics Center. So we started developing a logo. The first one that I liked the best was a chain link, red background, said the key link to the supply chain, I think is what it said. And so I circulated it around the board of directors of the Chamber of Commerce. I was the international chair for the Chamber for 7 years, and there was some giggling and snickering around the table, and I said, what's wrong? They said, this looks like bondage. So back to the drawing board, and we came up with a logo that our mayor particularly liked, and so we've adopted this logo for Jacksonville as America's Logistics Center, indicating all the modes of transportation that we have. One thing we have tried to do, I got it, the trademark registered, by the way. We found out that the only other city that tended to use that name was Memphis, where they were described in some publications as North America's Logistics Center. But we had no problem deciding that we should adopt this name. Memphis doesn't have a seaport, and we felt like we could do better. But one of the hurdles was to get it out onto the highways. For those of you who have driven to come to this conference, you may have seen as you get into Jacksonville, as you enter Jacksonville, that it's on the road. The State Department of Transportation generally doesn't like to put any signs up except, Baldwin 18 miles or 65 miles an hour, but I think they like this one because it had a truck. So what is it that we need to do it's an aspirational goal, what we need to keep doing to really make ourselves America's Logistics Center. There are three things. One is we need on-dock rail. The magic number is 47. If we can get a container off a ship to Chicago in 47 hours, we beat all the competition. Right now it takes about 47 hours to get a container from the ship over to the west side of Jacksonville to the rail yard. So we need on-dock rail. We're working on it. We got some federal money through the Tiger Grant. It's called an intermodal container transfer facility, and it's going to be finished next year. The second thing is to correct the situation at Mile Point. Mile Point is where the St. Johns River crosses the Intracoastal Waterway, and there's a current that causes ships to turn as they come through. The bar pilots have said that they won't allow the ships to come in more than 4 hours at each high tide. You know all the bridges we have in town. We have 7 bridges. It's like having our bridges closed 8 hours during the day and 8 hours at night. So it's a serious problem. It's in the recent bill that's under consideration, the WRDA bill in Congress, approval for fixing Mile Point, and the state government has said they would have the money. The third thing is to dredge our river to 47 feet. We have 40 feet now, but with the Panama Canal widening and deepening, we're not going to be able to take what they call the Post-Panamax ships. So we need to deepen the river to 47 feet. If we don't, there's some negative effects. Generally, we won't realize our potential as a national port. We'll only be a mid-size medium port, where Savannah, Charleston, and Miami will all be taking the role that we should have. Specifically, if we don't deepen the river, we will lose the Tray-Pack terminal that the Japanese company Mitsui U.S. Line spent $300 million to build and pumps over $100 million and will much more into the economy. They won't be able to survive here if we don't have deeper water. Bridgestone Firestone set up a 1 million square foot plant here, and they came because of the east-west traffic that the Tray-Pack terminal generated. But from a positive standpoint, you can see that if we deepen to 47 feet, these are figures by John Martin, who's the leading port consultant in the country and advises all the ports in Florida, that if we deepen the river to 47 feet, we can expect to have 14,000 new jobs. Some people have estimated as much as 35,000. We would have $1 billion per year extra in wages, salaries, and local consumption expenditures, another $900 million in direct business revenue, and the taxes that would be generated are $786.9 million, estimated at present value, which is more than the cost of dredging the river. I think that it's going to happen. We have a man here from the Corps of Engineers who can speak to it more than I can, but as you can see from this map of the river, aerial photograph, the Mayport Naval Station is where we've had a carrier. The John F. Kennedy was the last one. We had the Saratoga here for a long time. Those were conventional carriers, and they've been sent to rest. We're expecting to get a nuclear carrier, and in preparation for that, the entrance to the harbor, the river, up to the and into the basin have been deepened to 50 feet already. Mile Point, you can see where that is, where the Intracoastal Waterway crosses. The Blunt Island Command is on the eastern side of Blunt Island. That's where all of the equipment came through to go to Iraq, and about half of to go to Afghanistan. That has been deepened somewhat right around there. And you can see where the Mitsui terminal is, and the Hudson terminal. Hudson has decided not to come because of the recession, but that's a great spot for somebody right now. It's being used for the passenger terminal. But our deepening is not in the WRDA bill yet. We just had a big hurdle that was passed 2 days ago the Civil Works Review Board for the U.S. Corps of Engineers unanimously approved our plan. I think about 60% of that plan they approved deals with the environment. I can't speak to the environment part, that's for other people to talk about. But the environment, but the economic impact to Jacksonville is great. And not proceeding is also great in a negative way. So thank you very much.
Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Jaffee.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. A little clarification on some terms, in case people aren't aware. A Panamax ship is a large container vessel that can currently squeeze through the Panama Canal. The larger container vessels are called Post-Panamax. They cannot traverse the Panama Canal currently, so when those ships are bringing cargo from China, for example, they cross the Pacific Ocean, and they, since can't go through the Panama Canal, they go to the West Coast ports. Cargo is placed on a rail and moved across the country into the Midwest and the East Coast. So with the widening of the Panama Canal, the Post-Panamax ships, the large container vessels, will be able to go through the canal and come directly to the East Coast. So this is what we mean when we talk about Post-Panamax development. That is developing ports on the East Coast so that they can accommodate these larger vessels. So there's an anticipation of larger amounts of cargo. So all of the East Coast ports are engaged in competition and investment in order to capture the anticipated increase in cargo that presumably will result due to the widening of the Panama Canal, which is due maybe this year, maybe next year. That project is over budget and behind schedule, like most of these projects. The main issue regarding the Post-Panamax development of Jacksport are the costs and the benefits of dredging and deepening the St. Johns River to 47 feet to accommodate these larger Post-Panamax and additionally what are called new Post-Panamax vessels that will be coming through the Suez Canal. My comments will be framed in the context of the cost of the St. John's dredging project and the prospects that the financial investment will produce the anticipated and promised benefits. While people are using a $700 to $800 million figure for the dredging project, I would round it up to $1 billion. The local share accordingly will be at least $400 million. I assume these higher costs because no projected cost for such a project has ever been overestimated. By the time it takes place, if it ever does, the adjusted and additional cost will ramp it up to close to $1 billion in my estimation. So this is a very expensive project and one that requires a huge local share of what I would estimate to be at least $400 million. It's important to emphasize that so far there has been no comprehensive, impartial, independent cost-benefit analysis of this project. The Army Corps of Engineers report on this project is not a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. The sole and singular benefit that is calculated in the Corps' report is based exclusively and narrowly on savings in transportation costs as a consequence of bringing larger Post-Panamax vessels to the terminals. These benefits accrue primarily to retailers, shippers, and carriers, many foreign rather than domestic. But while these are the primary beneficiaries, it is the public that is being asked to bear the financial cost of this project. Further, there is no necessary or automatic relationship between a reduction in transportation costs and broader economic benefits for the local regional economy. And the Corps report does not calculate any such benefits. One thing we do know, reducing transportation costs perversely subsidizes and reinforces a global trade regime that has contributed to large trade deficits with Asian producers, as well as the loss of manufacturing jobs to low-wage countries. As long as these transportation costs can be kept low and be driven lower, the advantage of shifting production offshore will be retained, and there will be no economic incentive to produce these goods domestically. Now, looking at the calculation of the cost side of the core analysis, the sole and singular cost factored into the analysis is the dollar cost of the project, estimated in the report to be around $750 million. This does not include the potentially enormous environmental costs that you'll be hearing more about today from other speakers, and other costs associated with accommodating the large container vessels and the additional cargo, the necessary cranes, the bulkheads, the turning basins, and highway infrastructure. Regarding the benefits, most of the figures used to estimate the economic benefits, as has been noted, for this project are produced by a port consultant. This is Martin Associates. This is not an impartial third party. Martin Associates is closely tied to the interests of the port industry. It is a consulting firm hired by ports across the country. Almost every port hires Martin Associates to produce numbers, and they produce numbers that leverage a port's argument for expansion. Therefore, the job and revenue numbers produced by Martin Associates should not be accepted at face value. They should be interpreted with great caution and skepticism. As far as I can tell, Martin Associates has never met a port that did not require a deeper channel. And they've never met a port that didn't require hundreds of millions of dollars in additional infrastructure enhancements, usually paid for with other people's money. Martin Associates has produced what other analysts have described as inflated numbers. These are often used in a deceptive fashion by the port and its advocates. For a long time, and you may be familiar with this figure, Jacksport has claimed that the port creates 65,000 jobs, when in fact 42,000 of these 65,000, that is 66%, are what are related jobs. These jobs would remain even if the port closed tomorrow. More recently, a local member of Congress, in arguing for federal appropriations for the deepening project, was quoted as saying, quote, "With a deeper draft, the port has estimated that one shipping company alone would add 90,000 jobs to the region. Yet without my amendment," the congressperson went on, "these 90,000 jobs will be lost." 90,000 jobs, one shipping company. It's not clear where this number came from. It's not clear what shipping company this person is referring to, and in my consultation with Jacksport, they have no idea either. What all this tells me is that this is a game where people play very fast and loose with the numbers, and they play on the principle that the ends justify the means. Most of the conversation thus far has been about the quantity of jobs. What about the quality? The same Martin Associates report, which is a 2009 report, which estimated 65,000 jobs, also noted that the average income for workers would be $43,000 a year. No one should take this figure seriously. Based on my analysis of Bureau of Labor Statistics data on the local economy, and consistent with others who study the port logistics sector, the majority of jobs in port logistics are low wage and insecure. They can be placed in the ranks of what we call the growing precariat. These refer to precarious jobs in our labor market currently in the United States. Jobs that are temporary, jobs that do not provide benefits, and they also compensate at low wages. In this case, we are talking about primarily truck driving jobs and jobs in warehouse and distribution centers. Port logistics is not a high wage industry. For these jobs, the annual income, assuming full-time year-round employment, and that is becoming less common because these jobs are becoming increasingly precarious, is in the low to mid 20,000. This should not be surprising, as the purpose of the intermodal supply chain is to move the goods from the point of production, let's say in Asia, to the point of consumption in the United States, not only as rapidly, but also as cheaply as possible. But people have said that any job, no matter what level of compensation, is better than no job. Well, that may be so, but these jobs will be coming at a very high price tag. So there are good reasons to be skeptical about any cost-benefit numbers produced and disseminated by those that have a direct interest in the outcome. The practice of overstating the labor market and other benefits of economic development strategies and public work projects is unfortunately quite common. According to a comprehensive study of 258 transportation infrastructure projects, what are sometimes called mega projects, and the dredging project would qualify as a mega project. Support for these mega projects rests on a standard and predictable formula. That is, project public approval based on underestimating the costs, overestimating the revenues, undervaluing the environmental impacts, and overvaluing the economic development effects. This project is no exception to that standard formula. While there are still many obstacles to final project approval and funding, let's assume all the money is found, the project is complete, we have a 47-foot channel. Will this produce the desired impact of being a leading East Coast port, receiving the largest fully loaded first in, first out container vessels? No. Not even John Martin of the infamous Martin Associates would guarantee such an outcome. He said that once the project is complete, then Jacksport will need to develop a marketing plan to capture cargo from the other ports. Why? Because the competition is intense and there are other ports currently holding huge advantages over Jacksport that are already moving far more cargo, such as Miami, Savannah, Charleston, Norfolk, and New York, New Jersey. And none of these ports are sitting by idly. They are all making their own investments in deeper channels and or new infrastructure to sustain and improve their relative position in the East Coast port hierarchy. Not every East Coast port can be the first in and the last out. And if everyone tries, we will be engaged in an environmentally destructive and financially costly competition. By all indications, there will not be enough cargo and shipping business to justify the number of East Coast ports dredging deeper channels and harbors. All of this would suggest that it would make much more sense if the Corps would get together with the federal government and put together a plan to decide which East Coast ports should be doing what, which should be the first in and last out, and which ports should be playing a secondary role. This would be a much more rational policy, and it would also be much more financially responsible. One rather obscure but interesting important confirmation of Jacksport's relative second-tier position is the fact that the proposed P3 alliance, this is an alliance joining three of the largest global shipping firms, Maersk, Mediterranean Shipping Company, and CMA CGM, has disclosed its proposed East Coast shipping lanes and ports of call. Jacksport is not among them. There is now also a G6 alliance and a CKYH alliance of container shipping companies. This is a development that should be studied very carefully. The formation of these shipping alliances is a clear indication of general weakness and overcapacity in the container cargo business rather than an expanding volume of cargo that would justify additional port expansion. And there's one final point. Again, if this project is completed, supported, and we get to 47 feet of depth, we will still be below the desired 50 feet that most of the largest container vessels desire, and in some cases require. And the air draft under the Dames Point Bridge will be below the necessary height for the largest new Post-Panamax vessels. I can just imagine 5 years from now, we'll be sitting here arguing about dredging the river 4 more feet and, astonishingly, raising the Dames Point Bridge. In conclusion, let's return to the local financial cost. If the city is seriously contemplating an investment of $400 million minimum to dredge the river, it is imperative that they have an independent and comprehensive analysis of this project, its costs, its benefits, and its prospects for success. Once this is completed and reality sets in, I hope Jacksonville and Jacksport will see the wisdom of avoiding costly and destructive competition with other East Coast ports, which will ultimately prove unsuccessful, and accept its status as a second-tier Cascade-ready port with many strengths and opportunities, from its geographic location, which was pointed out earlier, to its rail connections, to its diverse range of cargoes, to its potential as a liquefied natural gas hub, to its established trade lanes with Central and Latin America. All of these can make Jacksport an economically viable, dynamic, and successful port without bankrupting the city and further deterioration to the St. Johns River.
Our next speaker is going to be Marc Hudson.
Morning, everyone. I'm going to start this out and say that the title of my presentation is Process, not the Port. And that's because we and many of the other environmental organizations who have come out to oppose this did not necessarily start out in that position. I personally spend most of my time in the woods. However, I do understand the significance of things like economies and jobs and the role of a port in all that. And so the actual advocacy, and I think what you'll hear from most of the environmental groups that are both here and out in the community, is that those who are opposed to it are worried about it from a responsible business standpoint, whether or not we can responsibly mitigate the impacts of the port or actually responsibly understand the environmental impacts that would come from a port dredging with the work that we've done up until today. So, so what you guys are about to get is the shortest primer ever on the environmental impacts from port dredging. The real truth is that port dredging everywhere in the country, not just in Jacksport, is always going to be a massively complex project. I don't blame you if most of you haven't read the environmental impact statement. It's a little bit over 1,000 pages, I think, if you include all the appendices. And the reason why it's that big of a document is because there's a lot of factors that you actually have to consider and that are all interconnected. So if you talk to environmentalists, you'll hear things about worry concerns about the tidal amplitude, residency times, impacts to the seagrass beds, the benthic habitats. There's conversations about blasting, sea level rise, responsible mitigation for the environmental impacts. None of these things actually exist in a bubble. And so they all have influences and impacts on each other, and in order to try to determine what those impacts are going to be, there had to be developed, I think, about a dozen models, I think probably used within the, not developed for this, but there were about a dozen different models that are actually used to try to understand the environmental impacts from just the Jacksonville Port dredge. And those things interrelate and they connect. And the one thing that I always say about models is, well, actually Mark Twain said. Mark Twain said about statistics and models that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And anybody who knows what Mark Twain was talking about, what he was essentially saying was that, and how it relates to this, is that if anybody tells you that they know what the environmental impacts are going to be from the Jacksport dredge, they're lying. What they're saying through the use of these models is that we kind of have a general understanding within a percent risk tolerance, which means that we are X% certain that we are going to get this environmental result. And when you actually talk about the opposition to the Jacksport dredge, that actually comes from that concern about risk tolerance. That the certainty of the projections through those models is not as high as what has been stated. And so the question of to dredge or not to dredge, like I said, is not really a question of whether or not it is uniformly an environmental negative or uniformly an economic benefit. It's really a question to the whole community is how comfortable do we feel with the level of risk going into this. And mine and what many other groups have said is that the risk is really pretty high in terms of determining those environmental impacts. So talk about the St. Johns River a little bit. Anybody knows the St. Johns River is a completely unique river within the country. If you wanted to experience the actual drop in elevation that happens on the St. Johns River from its headwaters to the ocean, you would actually have to go down 2 stories, look out down to the 3rd story, and you would be at the approximate elevation for the highest point of the St. Johns River. It only drops about 35 feet over the entire length. And that's rare for a river of its size. There's only a few other rivers in the country and in the world that you can actually use as comparable models to actually try to understand this. And guess what? Most of them actually already have deep enough harbors that they haven't actually had to consider port dredging projects of this nature. So the low, slow, it is the stereotype of a slow southern river. And it also has a long history of modification. It naturally tends to want to be 6 to 12 feet deep. People who know the history of Jacksonville knows that it was originally named Cowford. The reason it was named Cowford is because it used to be shallow enough that you could cross the cattle across the river here in Jacksonville. And so to get to 40 feet deep where we are now, there's been a 100-year-long history of dredging projects which have had a variety of different environmental impacts on the region over time. We've also changed the morphology. We cut a section off. Blunt Island used to just be a bend of the river. It wasn't an island at all, which also had a lot to do with in terms of allowing seawater and those kinds of things to actually travel up the river. It is the largest drainage in Florida, so again, it's kind of incomparable, and it currently has a significant amount of problems and developing problems that are only going to make it worse. You guys have probably heard, if you pay attention to the news, about the green monster problem. The residency times on the St. Johns River are really long, which means that the water doesn't flush very quickly. And so what that means is all the nutrients, all the bacteria, all the toxins really tend to build up before they get flushed out. And Jacksport could have a potential to make that worse. But there are other problems in terms of habitat loss with dredging over time, and reductions in species diversity and more. I'm doing a project right now where we're looking at the loss of coastal birds. And we have a number of coastal bird species here that from the 1970s to now we've experienced a 95% loss in their species numbers here in terms of the numbers of them that are actually staying and residing in this area. And a lot of that history has to do with dredge projects as well along the river, how it changed the river morphology and their ability to access the habitats they need. So, little history and kind of some problems with the process. A lot of you will have heard that there was a We Can't Wait initiative order put down from the President's office, which more or less halved the time to complete the environmental impact statement. Like I said, the completion of that environmental impact statement is not a simple thing. There's the Corps of Engineers had to go to an outside engineering company to assist them in it. There was a dozen models gone out, and that having the time really also created kind of a pretty significant confusion in the public comments. But there's also, you have to contextualize it in the time that We Can't Wait initiative order. It might have been that it was really possible to do that if we had had a healthy economy the last 5 or 6 years, tax surpluses, budgets hadn't been cut at state and federal natural resource agencies who were supposed to participate in the NEPA process. But unfortunately, the reality is we have had a depressed economy, we have had a sequester, we've had state cuts. And so that too has also negatively influenced the way that we've been able to actually analyze the environmental impacts on the St. Johns River from the port dredge. But there's also a problem in terms of the public comment process. One of the significant parts of NEPA is that it's the opportunity for the public to go look at the economic benefits of any large public works process and then weigh that against the environmental impacts, and for the public to actually weigh in on whether or not they think that's a good deal. Because of the halving of the project time, we had kind of an unprecedented public comment process in the Jacksport dredge. We had 2 releases of the EIS, we had an initial and a later one, and we had a rolling public comment process. So rather than what would typically happen is we get a completed EIS and we make comment back, there was a number of different models were being completed at different times, and because, like I said, it's not within a static system, they changed the entire nature of the report each time it came out. So you had to, I think I reread it about 4 or 5 times as different studies came out in a 1,000-page EIS. So it's not when you're talking about access to the general public, to that public comment process, which is so meaningful in terms of our ability to weigh in on whether or not we want a large public works comments, it was really severely reduced. And another problem with the comment is, another purpose of the NEPA process is to provide a number of reasonable alternatives and for the public to weigh in on which one they like. There are many out here that feel that there was a failure to provide a lot of significant and serious alternatives in terms of the length of the dredge project, the width, different construction techniques, and so forth. Environmental concerns that we've had a problem with is, and this is since the completing of the EIS just yesterday in terms of the local review process at the Corps' end, there's sea level rise and some of the salinity models. What the Corps actually said is that, sea level rise is so bad that if it gets to a certain point, the port dredging is actually negligible. And as a result, in doing their salinity modeling, they only considered the baseline and the most favorable sea level rise scenario and left out the median and the worst case scenario. And they said this because, well, if sea level rise really does raise 3 feet, the port is not the most significant concern. But what it doesn't really recognize is that we would have shifted the baseline condition of those salinity problems prior to sea level rise. So it doesn't have an amplifying impact. The ecological models used in that also had no statement of risk tolerance. In other words, they didn't actually know how accurate the ecological models were, and that was something that was recognized. I have a picture here of a guy using a divining rod, which is how you used to find water. And I would say that the science of hydrogeology has progressed significantly since then, where they used to know about 1% of all there was to know about our local aquifers. They've probably improved their efficiency by about 300, 400% and know about 4% of what there is to know about the local aquifers. And so there is actually conflicting studies out right now about the impacts of saline water intrusion into our aquifer. There is a report out that says that they think that it's connected to the Floridian aquifer, and there is a potential for saline saltwater intrusion to happen in our Floridian aquifer, which we all drink from. And I'm going over my time, so I'm going to speed up through this. Salinity impacts, again, there was initially predicted 300 acres of benthic habitats, those are seagrasses, submerged aquatic vegetation, 450 acres of wetlands impacts. That gets really important when you actually talk about the offsets of those environmental damages. The initial environmental impact statement allowed for $80 million in mitigation funding. And that got reduced to $27 million, 23 which is monitoring. Now they've done an adaptive management plan, which means that we're going to monitor, look to see if there's something that goes beyond what our predicted results are and mitigate in the future. The problem as an environmentalist that I have for that is the St. John system is so complex, nailing a problem down in the future to just being port dredging is going to be a problem. And people here who have done that kind of work, it could potentially be a litigious problem. And not only that, there's always a question of where that money is going to come from. If it's not in the initial WRDA a request for funding, then it has to come out of the Corps' regular budgetary things, which is a different political process in terms of ensuring that that money comes about. But that's it.